Welcome to As-Sahwa's podcast, encouraging revival of the mind and the heart, seeking the truth and standing for what is right in the age of overloaded misinformation. The riots aren't anything new to the UK. I think it's best to cast our mind back to 2001 in Bradford, known as the Bradford Riots. There was a planned protest by the National Front, and I actually thought the National Front was banned by that time, but anyhow, that's a different thing. Or maybe remnants of the National Front. And we could talk about who were the National Front as well. Anyway, at that time, the Home Secretary, he banned the protest, what was called under the Public Order Act 1986, because of what chaos it would bring. What we saw from there was white youths, Asian, predominantly Pakistanis. I think there's about 68,000 Pakistanis alone living there, minus the other Muslim population from Bangladesh, from India, from parts of Africa, etc. So you saw this massive riot for about 2 or 3 days between the white youth and the Asian population. It cost the country £7 million worth of damage. There was 24-hour courts, but when you look at the sentencing, you find that the Asian population were given harsher sentences compared to their white counterparts. And that's a question to really ask, why would you go down that road? Now, National Front. Why would the National Front want to engage in such a so-called protest? And you know, to be honest, it's not a protest, it's not a demonstration, and this is where we need to be clear. The far right are not doing a protest or a demonstration. They are staging hate more than anything else. Now, Bradford itself has had an immigrant population for a very long time. If you looked at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a massive Irish population. Then 40s and the 50s, there were a massive Polish population. Then the end of, you could say around the 50s, when you saw an Asian population coming. So the indigenous population of Bradford weren't totally against just Asians, but they were against anyone who was an immigrant, doesn't matter if they were white or black. Mm-hmm. So the reality is that it was just pure hate. Let's kind of fast forward and get down to 2011. Mark Duggan, who was shot by the police in Walthamstow. There was mass demonstrations, protests, and then rioting, looting. I was in South London at that time, and I just wanted to see for myself. And I actually recorded the looting, and that was surprising. There was a T-Mobile shop, and they had smashed the place down, taken all the phones, taken everything, and put it on fire, which is bizarre. People were banging on the door because it was a flat upstairs to say, "Get out, there's a fire." And they were in shock. They came running out with whatever bits and pieces they could. It caused nothing but devastation. Those riots were in London, Liverpool, many cities of the UK. There were over 3,000 arrests made, and the courts extended the hours by around nearly 3,500 hours of court time. Again, extra cost, extra chaos to the UK. 2024. When this young person from Wales decided to go to Southport and stab these young girls, the first thing people assumed was he was a refugee and that he was also a Muslim. And the likes of Tommy Robinson, whose actual name is Stephen Christopher Yaxley Lennon, I wonder why he changed his name or hid his name behind Tommy Robinson. With the hate he's been spewing out for the last many, many years, the lies and the misinformation that he had been spreading on X and other social media platform. And I'm quite surprised because when it kicked off between Palestine and the issue of Israel, there was major things happening in the social media world, and people are still saying it's happening now, where if you got a post on Israel, Palestine hashtag, they remove it. You know, Elon Musk with all his so-called freedom of speech and what he's been doing as well, that this person is allowed still to be on social media. By the way, Tommy Robinson is a wanted man. Now, he apparently put on X, his own account, that he's been pursued for terrorism charges. But others say, actually, no, he's been pursued for grooming young boys, which is most probably the story, but nothing's been confirmed. What astonishes me is that this person has decided to take a break holiday with his family in Cyprus. Who's funding him is the question to ask. What job does he do? How much is he even earning to do such a thing? Which is another strange scenario. It just doesn't make sense that you're sitting in a foreign land, you're worried about your own country, and you're saying, we need to take our country back. You are drumming the beats of war in your own country, encouraging your own countrymen to cause chaos. Go to those immigration centers. But those immigration centers are not all centers, they're hotels. You're damaging the UK economy. You're fighting your own countrymen. And yet you call that, we're taking our country back. Tommy Robinson, EDL, he says it's no longer around. But just before EDL was disbanded, there was a EJDL, which is the English Jewish Defence League. What defending are they doing in the first place to even say that they're a defence league? Secondly, what's with the connection of the Jewish Defence League? It clearly shows that people like Tommy Robinson have an absolute connection with the Zionist movement. He's been in and out of Israel. And apparently now he's meeting people from the Hinduva organization. He might be, or he's on his way to go to India. So it kind of begs the question, if you're anti-immigrant, okay, you can't say openly now that when we don't like brown people or black people, but you're going to those very people who you did show hatred for many, many years ago. Now you're being very clever with your words and you're kind of keeping away from it. But this is nothing new. Now, Nigel Farage has been speaking about immigration for a very long time. He's been recording himself driving around, going outside his hotels and these immigration centers and saying, these are the people where they're being, kept. These are the places where the immigrants are staying here free of charge. Okay? And now Nigel Farage is crying and saying, no, it wasn't me. I didn't encourage anything wrongdoing. Tommy Robinson, same thing. But what we have to see is that this is nothing new, because for the last 10, 15 years, we have seen an anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiment in the whole of Western Europe. The Netherlands, France, and Austria. And now here in the UK. So the question we need to really ask is, where do we go from here? Abu Baraa, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you here, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion regarding the situation, present situation, because we're still in this situation right now. What are your thoughts on these riots?
Well, I mean, the first thing we have to acknowledge is the fear that's spread across the country right now. Women are afraid to go out in the streets. We're hearing reports all the time. I was hearing reports yesterday of women, Muslim women, specifically visibly Muslim women, those who wear the hijab, for example, being targeted. And that has been a common theme for racist attacks for a very long time, that they particularly target the vulnerable, the weaker, or the more visibly Muslim, first of all, and the more vulnerable members of the community, women, children, men on their own, perhaps, or young children. They tend not to go after people who can defend themselves a bit better. So we're hearing about acid attacks, people going around in cars throwing acid at women wearing hijab. We're hearing about these checkpoints where they're stopping cars or who are being driven by non-white drivers. Let alone setting fire to hotels and buildings, attacks on mosques. There's so much that's going on. People are afraid. As a result of these riots, people have boarded up their shops and closed down their businesses for days out of concern about what could be happening with all these riots. So that spread of fear does quite clearly seem deliberate. It's an attempt to intimidate the public, the entire community, and that has been achieved. And that's quite an important thing for us to recognize. The fact that intimidation has happened and the reasons why. So immediately we need to appreciate that as a community, minority communities, not just the Muslim community, but all minorities, we have always been in a vulnerable position where we've had to deal with, from time to time, fear of attack, just because of the color of our skin, the heritage that we might have, religious or racial, and that's a very different experience of living in the UK compared with others who maybe have a different demographic. And that's not to say that anybody who is not a minority is a cause for that. But there is a clear difference in the experience, the life experience, the lived experience of somebody who is living in the UK and having to deal with not just daily microaggressions and racist language, sometimes maybe shout in the streets, but also a deeper level of this othering, treating as less than human, just because of the fact that you are a minority. And that runs right the way through to what's on the TV, what's on the billboards, what's on the news, what's being discussed in Parliament, the laws and policies that are being approached, some things you've been discussing before, the way the criminal justice system works, the way police deal with you, the way the courts deal with you, the way you're sentenced, the way you're treated in prison as well. It runs through everything. And I think a very shallow way to look at it is just to point to the far right community, who are relatively small themselves, though they are very loud and they do have some of the most obvious acts of violence and are cause for fear. But we don't want to make the mistake of pretending that they are the start and end of racism in this country, or the threat that we face as minority communities living in the UK. It's a lot wider than that, and we need to explore that, I think.
It does go back to politics. Mm-hmm. What we find is in Europe, Western Europe, when it comes to elections and the politicians, they're looking around to see what's the thing that the population is complaining about. So for years they've been saying that the white population is being neglected and we've given too much to the immigrants here. So the question to really ask is, what immigration are you talking about? Are you talking about illegal immigrants, or are you talking about the immigrants that have been here for 3, 4, 5 generations? So when my father came over, 1961, some of his friends came over, mid-50s. Now, if we look our generations now, we're kind of coming to 3rd, 4th, 5th generation, right?
Yeah.
So are you talking about us, or are you talking about those guys that come on the dinghies and cross the channel illegally, according to British law, right? The reality is, if you've seen the screenshots of some of the far-right groups that have been infiltrated from their chats, Telegram, WhatsApp, it's all about Pakis and niggers. That's all it is. It's not about the immigrant that's come over on the dinghy. I attended the demonstration in Stoke Newington yesterday, and then went to Walthamstow, and the numbers were fantastic. But what I was more happy about is there were a lot more non-Muslims, white, black, non-Muslims, even Sikhs, Hindus. They all came. You see, the difference or the mistake, the racists, I don't even call them far right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we shouldn't even give them that term, really. Even the word scum is good. It's too good for them. So I think really the best thing to really call them is trash. Honestly, they're just absolute trash. Because when you listen to the argument, why are you here? It's because the immigrants. I'm sorry, I don't want to sideline a certain population, but I'm really sorry. The reality, we're talking about those that we hear and we see in and around London.
Yeah.
They have this strange way of speaking about politics. It's all about the immigrants. What about the immigrants? Well, have you not realized, Mr. Trash, what you're looking at is when you go to your local hospital, when you go to the GP, they're all immigrants. Or they're the children of immigrants. Mm-hmm. When you look at all you got to do is you've got to look at the name on the plaque outside the GP surgery. And what do you see? Mr. Patel, Mr. Khan, right? So what you're saying is, I can't get a job. Well, I'll tell you why Mr. Khan got a job. Because he worked hard at his GCSEs and his A-levels. And he became a surgeon. But you, trash, decided to just sit home and drink beer and get drunk. That's it. Right? That's the reality of what we are seeing. None of them have a sound argument when it comes to the issue of immigrants. But who's been fueling all of this?
And that's a good question, because I think when you look to even these protests, and I try to be as fair as possible and as objective as possible, some of the scenes are horrific. Some of the interviews that have been given are ridiculous. Idea about the Titanic sank because there were too many people on it. The idea that immigrants are stealing all the jobs, but they're not even working. It doesn't make any sense. So there's a difference, I think, between the level of information and education that some of the people are faced with or lumbered with, and that might give a clue as to why they're maybe not succeeding in life as well, and why they're looking for an explanation. But who's giving them that explanation? Because there are other people like Nigel Farage who are a bit more intelligent, who are a bit more articulate, and people like even Tommy Robinson, Stephen Lennon, Lemon, whatever you want to call him. There are some people who have a bit more the gift of the gab, able to speak, a bit more charismatic. They have a bit more education as well. Now, there's a whole spectrum of people who are affected and influenced by this, and you also actually need to go beyond these names. I think these names are also a bit of a victim of scapegoating right now, by those who have more power than them. Because Nigel Farage doesn't really have any power. Tommy Robinson doesn't really have any power, and I don't think one tweet is really enough to influence an entire nation. I mean, if that was the case, what are the politicians for? The truth is, there are people who have been in power, who have been in parliament, who have been giving interviews for months, years, stoking these fears, that have been telling the community, those people who can't get jobs, those people who are suffering from austerity measures that have been going on for a couple of decades now, those people who are living below the breadline, the people who are the cause of that poverty, that mismanagement of this country, the Conservative Party, politicians especially, everybody from Boris Johnson to Rishi Sunak to Suella Braverman, they've been fueling these flames for a very long time. And I believe they have been far more effective at it than Tommy Robinson or Nigel Farage. Now that it's all gone to rioting, those politicians and their colleagues and the media and the press, who are also just as culpable, to be honest, for spreading these ideas, they are now turning to put the blame on Tommy Robinson, put the blame on Nigel Farage, find somebody to blame. But these people are really nobodies. They don't really have any immediate influence. If they did, Nigel Farage would have won something by now. He's never won anything because he doesn't really have that much of a following. he's a populist, and there's a slight difference between populism and nationalism as well, which we should discuss and talk about. But the people have been telling those, those people. I don't want to call them trash. I don't want to call them names. To be honest with you, I actually have a bit of sympathy for them a little bit as well. Not when they're rioting and putting things on fire, but when they're at home in poverty, they're not having to eat, they don't know how to feed their kids. I can understand why they are upset, and I can understand why they feel angry. The problem is they are also a victim of propaganda, where they've been told by Suella Braverman that we need to send people to Rwanda and spend billions of pounds sending 3 people to Rwanda because they came on a dinghy, as if they are the cause for the poverty in this country. Whereas these people are sitting with all the money in their banks. Rishi Sunak is one of the richest people in the country. He never spent a penny to help anybody. He's been raking it in as long as he was Prime Minister, exploiting all of us and blaming on people who are running away from a war somewhere, fleeing persecution, and saying it's their fault. And the problem is the ideas of nationalism, the idea of national pride, the idea of everybody in this in-group within the country, that we are one unit and we are the best and we are better than everyone else and anyone foreign is low. That idea of nationalism is quite integral to the way the British politics works and the way that British government works, and even the Western model of statehood. It works based upon this idea of nation states, of nationality, nationalism. And so they've been feeding everybody this idea for a very long time that foreigners are a threat to you, whether they're coming in as immigrants or whether they are far away doing some kind of terrible terrorism things, and that they're all backwards and they don't know how to live and they're all uncivilized terrorists, but we're not, we're the good guys. That message is quite important for British propaganda, for all of their foreign policies, for all of their wars, for all of their justifications to support Israel and the genocide that's going on. It's quite important to have that narrative there, which is why it's difficult to now turn around and say that people who are nationalistic are terrorists. That's why they don't want to use those terms for them or to punish them too harshly, because they want them to be angry about nationality. They want them to be angry at foreigners, but they just don't want to riot because they need to be in control. They don't want them to be disobeying the law which they've set. So this doesn't go back to Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage. They are just small players in this. People have been told that immigration is the problem for a very long time. People have, from in the Conservative Party especially, but even the Labour Party are not completely innocent, even though they are well known, known to be more friendly towards immigrants and more friendly towards the working classes. The Conservatives and the Labour Party have had some part to play in this, but particularly for the last couple of decades, Conservative MPs have played on these fears for a very long time to retain their seats, to win votes, to try to hold on to their seats, or even to win leadership elections, because we've seen so many musical chairs in the cabinet and the prime minister's chair. Every time they want to come to power, they need to win votes, and sorry to say, many of the Conservative Party members that decide who's going to be the leader of the Conservative Party are racist, just to be put blunt, and they're very Islamophobic. So you can't really win those votes unless you're willing to be a bit racist and say a few racist things, say a few Islamophobic things. And so they say it, and they claim that they are champions of free speech. I'm going to say it how it is. I'm not afraid to speak. I don't fear censorship. And they use these racist words in order to drum up support. I think that is far more dangerous and far more of a motivating factor to these riots than a few tweets by Tommy Robinson or Nigel Farage.
We can't still dismiss the fact that people like Tommy Lemon, or as I say, Tommy No Name, has played his part in this.
Of course.
Right?
Absolutely.
And Nigel Farage and various Conservatives MPs coming out saying certain things. There was another one from the Conservative Party, Robert
Jenrick,
Jenrick, isn't it? Who said that anybody who shouts Allahu Akbar should be arrested.
Immediately arrested, no questions asked.
Because the fact that it's only extremists who use it. Now, I was thinking about this today, and I just thought to myself, well, actually, why do you fear Allahu Akbar, right, so much in the streets? It's saying God is great, or God is the greatest, Allah is the greatest. So why does that affect you so much? Okay. So it's got nothing to do with ideology, because every Muslim says Allahu Akbar when he prays how many times a day? So what's the problem with that? Okay. Reality is that someone like Robert Jenrick is still playing that anti-Muslim, anti-Islam sentiment, and they want it going.
Yeah.
So some articles I read said, why are the white indigenous population unhappy with where they are? Okay, because of the way they've been treated. Well, I'm sorry. Reality is that you're being unfairly treated. To what reason? Okay, because you're complaining about jobs, but the immigrants are doing jobs that you don't want to do. They're doing the jobs, right? But you mentioned the issue of nationalism, and I want to kind of come back to that as well, if you don't mind. Now, the effects of nationalism we have seen, okay, and we are seeing, and you're absolutely right. They are refusing to use the words extremist and terrorist. I mean, forget, they're not going to even say the word terrorist, even though I've heard some of the police chiefs are saying that those, I'm sorry to say, the trash that have been arrested should be tried according to terrorism laws because of what they have done and what they are doing. Now look, reality is this. When something happens to the Muslim community or to the black community, they don't go in a rioting and smashing up white people's houses, white people's cars, just because they're white. That's
facts.
That's it.
Yeah.
Right? That's the reality. So what is it about nationalism that causes so much harm and has caused so much harm? Is it correct to say, or would you say in a opinion that this has been a Christian nationalism writing?
I think it is relevant, actually, but more accurate, I would say, is a European, maybe you could say European Christian nationalism. And the reason why I say that is because Christianity obviously originated in the Middle East, Palestine. It spread across Africa. It spread across many parts of the world. Europe was a little bit different. When Christianity reached Europe, things changed. So if we can have a little bit of a history lesson, in the 15th and 16th century, Europe used to have lots of wars with each other in the Middle Ages. They were fighting each other. France, Britain, invading each other all the time, taking each other's territory. Germany, all the countries. There came a point, and when you study international relations, the majority of international relations scholars, they refer back to something called the Westphalian Settlement. Now, this was an agreement just between European nations where they said, okay, look, let's stop fighting each other. We'll respect each other's borders. Each of our nation states. So the English have their land, territory. You won't attack me anymore. The French have their territory. We won't attack you anymore. The Germans have their land. I mean, it wasn't called Germany then, but you had different nation states, and each of them respected each other and said, okay, look, we're not going to attack each other. But at the same time, they had something called the doctrine of discovery, and this was something from the church, the Christian church. It was a very important element to this. So the Pope declared something called the doctrine of discovery, which was a rule to say that European Christian nations in particular, they have the right to discover other countries or nations. And then the first one among them to discover a new country, it belongs to them. And they can enslave everybody there, colonize it, settle it, and so on. And that's what they did. So this settlement, and this has been known to be the model of peace that they are trying to build the world on. They're basically saying the whole world should take a lesson from the Europeans who they managed to stop fighting each other and have this peace. So this is how we can have peace in the world. But of course, it wasn't a peaceful agreement, because it was an agreement to say we won't fight each other, but we'll conquer the rest of the world. we'll go out and colonize, enslave, torture, rape, or do whatever we want to anybody else because they're not human. Because the idea was, if they're not Christians in Africa, if they're not Christians in the newly found America, this is why it came out, because they just discovered America. So they said, what are we going to do with this? And I said, well, you discovered it. The 100 million people that were living there at the time, as if they don't exist. You can just kill them all. You can commit a genocide, ethnically cleanse them all from the land, enslave them, do what you want. It's your land. And then they went around all the world, went around the world discovering places that were already discovered and enslaving the people. That's what colonization was. And the premise behind it all was that European Christians were superior to everyone else. The European Christians, they were the enlightened people. They were religiously enlightened. Everybody else were heathens. They were infidels. They were, they didn't have any rights. They didn't have any right to the land. They didn't have any right to their own autonomy. They didn't have the right, or they didn't have the capacity, because they also started to continue to build upon that and say, well, they are the most evolved people, as Darwin's theory suggested that white Europeans were the most evolved and black Africans were less evolved, and so that they were superior in every way. And so it became a large part of the culture to belittle every other culture and claim they never had anything, to take everything from other countries and claim it for your own. So they started to paint Africa as being very backward, Arabia as being very backwards. All other countries were savages, essentially. And that rhetoric had never really changed. Right into the 20th century, they were still going off this type of rhetoric, and they still haven't really corrected. There are a lot of people who challenge it, but most of the time they get ignored. And so that idea of European nation states being the best and the brightest and the superior, far more superior than everybody else, is completely rooted in the idea that nationalism is what binds the people. So some type of national identity, sometimes rooted in the idea that we are the ethnically English people of the land, sometimes rooted in other ways, because of course England has all sorts of different races within it, everything from Viking to French to German to let alone all the other immigrants that have come over hundreds of years. So there's some kind of idea of national identity, and that has been the basis that statehood has been understood by Westerners for a long time, and they really can't see any other way to define statehood. They can't conceive of the idea that actually people used to have states and peace without nationalism, and they use nationalism to break apart countries and split people up in different countries. They went to Iraq and say, why are you all doing together? What you're all doing together is one country. The Kurds should have a country. The Sunnis should have a country. The Shia. Where did this idea come from? It comes back from this. And they started to spread that idea, and they called it civilizing everybody. They said they have a white man's burden. Because the white man is so superior, they have to go around civilizing everyone, educating them all. So what we found was this idea of extreme nationalism, where you feel so proud of your own people, you're so blindly loyal to your own people, is what leads to racism. Because if you are the best, everyone else is less than you. Everybody else who's not from your nationality, not from your nation, everybody else who's a different race, a different color, a different community, different religion, they are less human than you. And so it's a natural result of Western nationalism. You can't really escape that cycle, and it never has. Britain has never escaped that cycle, neither has America.
The understanding of nationalism and the effects of nationalism has also affected the Muslim population. And I'm actually glad and appreciate that you did bring up that little bit of history lesson, because of the fact that the Muslim countries we see today are 55 plus, I think. Every one of them has their own flag. Some of them speak the same language, literally the same language, but they are a different country. And we can see throughout the last 100 years that all these countries are not older than 70, 80 years old, right? And one of those that we see will be celebrating its so-called independence is on the 14th of August, which is next week. Pakistan Independence Day. I don't want to dwell on it too much in this session, but my fear is with the present climate, you're going to see in places like Bradford, Birmingham, Manchester, London, these youngsters come out in their cars driving like, okay, I won't say the word. I was going to use a word, but I think I'd avoid that word. Making a fool of themselves, doing haram, doing something that is against Islam, waving their flags as if they have so much pride in it. But you know, the reality is they don't understand the flag of Pakistan. Then they themselves will be people who are attacking others because of their nationalism, but yet they are proud to call themselves British. And this is a question I ask a lot of them is, you say all these wonderful things about Pakistan and you speak about Pakistan in this way or that way. I don't understand. If Pakistan is such a great country, fantastic country, why have you made Britain your home? I say it's just a question. Think about it. That's all you got to think about. And a lot of them will say, eventually, I'm going to go back there. I said, no, you're not. A lot of you say that. But go and look at the Muslim graveyards in this country from the South Asian countries. How comes that uncle over there that's passed away and he's 80 years old, 90 years old, he's buried here in England, not in Pakistan? It's a question to ask, really. But what I don't want to see are these young youth go out next week on the 14th of August, waving their flags, driving up and down like maniacs, getting in trouble with the police, making a fool of themselves, drinking on weed and what have you. And then it kicks off into another riot because of the present climate. That is my fear, okay?
Yeah.
But moving on from there.
But just on that point, actually,
Yeah.
if I can just mention
Please.
the point, because I think, I mean, you mentioned a very important point in passing. These are very young kids. And that's also true, actually, of many of the people who are coming out in these riots. And I don't think they're all riots as well. I've seen some places where I think that people just genuinely, they want to protest. They don't know necessarily what's, good or bad about their policies or what it is that they want to change. But not all of them were riots, and we have to be fair with them. We don't want to fall into the mistake of just repeating very exaggerated language. I think many of the people are just angry about the situation that Britain is in, and they look to immigration. But then they may be 17 years old, 16 years old. These are kids. They some of them barely maybe have just passed their GCSEs, if they even passed any. It's it's not necessarily the case that they know enough about the world to really be able to understand how Britain got to where it is. They haven't been here for very long, so all they have is what they've been given, and they would have been taught to be nationalistic in school, on TV. There's this idea of this banal nationalism everywhere, mundane, day-to-day things. You're seeing the British flag everywhere, World Cup, flags everywhere. You're seeing the Olympics. Everybody's telling you, reinforcing this idea that, look, we're all nationalities, we're all national, have all these national loyalties that we should have. And so they've been feeding this, these ideas to them, both the Pakistani nationalists, British nationalists, English, Welsh, whatever it is, continuously everywhere. Sometimes they even force you. Nowadays, you can't even open a new account somewhere without putting your nationality, and they'll stick a little flag next to your username. And so who put that there? I didn't ask to be identified by the place where I live, where I was, place where I was born. How is that my identity? And this is the thing. We've all been told that our nationality or citizenship is so important to who you are, that's part of your ID. That's what identifies you to other people. As a Muslim, we shouldn't think like that. But how would we know that we're not supposed to think like that unless we've been told? When you're 17, you may never have been educated in that way. So the Prophet ﷺ, taught us in one of the most profound statements that really undermines the whole concept of Western nation statehood based on nationalities, when he said that that no black is better than a white, no white is better than a black, no Arab is better than a non-Arab, no non-Arab is better than an Arab, except by taqwa, by piety, by how virtuous you are, how pious and good you are in your good deeds, essentially, and your closeness to God. So that's something you can control. The color of your skin is not something you can control. So we shouldn't really be uniting together, with each other just based upon the color of our skin, or the language that we speak, or the place that we were born. These are not really measures of virtue in the first place. So if that's how your unity is going to be based, you're going to end up standing with people who are no good for you, but you're blindly loyal to them because you think, well, we're brothers based on our language or our race or our color. That should never really have been the basis of our unity in the first place. And unless we really educate ourselves and educate our children in that, it's going to be very difficult to break that cycle.
Just going back to the present situation, one thing I realize, as we mentioned before, they're not using the words extremist or terrorist and what have you. But I wonder if the government will take the stance. In fact, they probably won't take the stance. But the stance they took against the Muslim community and said the Muslim community has a responsibility to speak about the extremists amongst us and the extremists in their community. The Muslim community must condemn the actions of these extremists. The Imams should take responsibility and condemn what's going on. And I got sick of that word, condemn.
Yeah.
I haven't heard one church condemning the actions of these thugs, rioters. I'm not going to say protesters. These trash, I'm sorry. But not one church has come out, not one priest, vicar, bishop. Maybe they might have said something in general, but they have not come out specifically. Now, these so-called nationalists, when they come out, they all speak about, we ain't going to allow Sharia law to be implemented in this country. I'm so sorry for putting that accent on. I'm not saying every thug, every rioter, every nationalistic trash is that kind of person. No, but I'm sorry. That's all the kind of accents I get to hear, right? Mm-hmm. Now, they speak about this is a Christian country. Okay, this is a Christian country, but your actions don't show Christianness. Mm-hmm. You're not helping your neighbor. You're trying to kill your neighbor. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, will the government implement the prevent strategy on these rioters? Will social services now go and take that 14-year-old rioter and say, you don't belong with your family because your family have radicalized you? It's time for you to go into foster care and we'll send you with Mr. and Mrs. Ahmad. I hope so. I hope that happens. But do you actually think the government would go that far?
No, of course not. And we don't even need to really question that. We know that they won't. The question is, why won't they? And at the same time, we should also point out that, this is a hypocrisy, definitely. It's a double standard, definitely. But I wouldn't want the government to start using the extreme violence and discrimination that they use against the Muslim community against anybody else. Even if they were racist, I don't think it's right what they've been doing to the Muslim community to prevent statutory strategy. It's a failed policy, and it was incredibly harmful to everybody. It is just outright wrong. So, I wouldn't wish that upon anybody, even my enemy. It's wrong. And I also don't expect the churches to come out and condemn it. Although, if you want equivalency, then that's what should be happening, and that's what the government should be calling for. Obviously, that's not going to happen. And the reason why it's not going to happen is because the idea of terrorism, extremism, these are terms used to describe your enemies, your opponents. And the government doesn't see its own people as its enemy. They see them as its constituents, its voters. It's angry, why are you rioting? But they don't see them as the enemy. They see foreigners as the enemy because they are still within the cycle of nationalism. They see Muslims as their enemy. And the reason why they present Muslims as enemy and have been for a long time is tied to many things, many wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine in particular. Islamophobia and the idea that Muslims are terrorists is pivotal to the Israeli propaganda narrative. If Muslims were not terrorists, then why are you bombing the hospitals? Why are you bombing the schools? Why are you bombing the universities? Why are you bombing the libraries? All of them. Why are you completely destroying everything? Why are you bombing the refugee camps and people in tents? The only way that they're able to come up with any answer for that is to say, well, look, these Muslims are terrorists. They all look like terrorists to us. They all look the same. They're hiding terrorism. There's a terrorist inside that hospital. This is a terrorist school, so that's why we are bombing them. And unless you have enough hatred and ignorance and prejudice towards the Muslims, you wouldn't really accept that to be true. So they rely on that hatred and that ignorance in order to gain acceptance from the people. So it's a process of what's called securitization. So the securitization theory is an explanation of how governments drum up support for extreme action, violent action outside of normal politics. So it is based on some type of speech act or some type of call to action from the people, where they identify somebody that needs to be protected, a threat to them, that valued object of protection, and calling to some kind of extreme action that can bypass all the normal rules and values and morals in order to meet that threat. So Muslims have always been that threat, and they've been painting the Muslims as that threat for a very long time. And your national people, your national co-residents, whether they're racist or not, those same people who are rioting, they are the people that are supposed to be protected. The government been telling them, we're trying to protect you. That's why you're giving us the power to do all of these things to Muslims, prevent strategy, channel, counterterrorism, these protests for Palestine. How are they justifying 5-year sentences for people protesting for an end to genocide? No rioting, no looting. We've already seen the first few sentences that 2 years, 3 years. It's nothing. So how are they going to justify that if your own people are the threat? They can't paint their own people as the threat to the world, as the backward savages that need to save everybody from. That has to be foreigners. That has to be somebody outside of what is the valued national referent object, or the objects of security. So it doesn't fit the narrative. They reserve terrorism. Terrorism, by the technical definition, happens all the time in the UK. Nearly half of all the mosques in the UK have been attacked in the last 3 years. Firebombing of mosques is so frequent. It happens all the time, hundreds of times. By the technical definition of terrorism, and I've got the definition in front of me, it says that an act of terrorism is a use or threat of action where the use or threat is designated to influence the government or to intimidate the public, like the riots. And the use or threat is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. Now, there are further stipulations to that law as well, where they say if there are explosives used or firearms used, then it doesn't matter what your intention was. It's terrorism automatically. And it needs to cause significant harm to buildings or property, or to a person, to humans, or the threat of that violence. Now, the riots meet that. Every firebombing of a mosque should automatically be classed as terrorism. If you realize this, then the vast majority of terrorist incidents in this country have really been targeting Muslims, against Muslims. But that doesn't fit the narrative. How can you protect Israel and their policy and their genocide if the Muslims are the victim of terrorism, not the perpetrators themselves? So it's very carefully orchestrated to reserve these terms and laws and policies and sentences for certain communities in order to push that same propaganda narrative. Because if you can't do that, then you cannot justify or drum up support for wars, for foreign policy, the beneficiaries of which are really not the working class people in Britain, but the government and their own, usually their own people within government among the richer elites of this country.
Adding to that, a lot of the counter protests, which are actually protests, they did end up chanting a lot about Palestine.
Mm.
And when you look at the communities like I did yesterday, and you saw everybody chanting, white, black, Muslim, non-Muslim. So Palestine has become a shining star, has become so clear to the world. And the situation in Palestine will be a marker in history, and no doubt will be taught generation to generation to generation of what has happened and what we're going to be. Maybe the great grandfathers were witness to what they saw and what they spoke about and what they did. That's the reality of things, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast, Abu Baraa. What I really want to concentrate on now is we've seen the Muslim response, and with that Muslim response, I want to say that I'm proud of the Muslim community. I'm proud of the youth that came out, that weren't afraid. I'm proud of those Muslim businesses which stayed open, which stood there and protected their businesses. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
What I also want to say is that the Muslim community should be proud of the fact that they didn't go out looking for a fight. They were not the one. We weren't the ones who caused chaos. Yes, there were minor arrests and what have you. Many Muslims up north, Manchester, Stoke-on-Trent, were arrested and charged with affray. Now, my fear is the law going to be harsh on them more than their white counterparts? Let's see. At the same time, I want to say what I saw yesterday in Stoke Newington and Walthamstow, the support from the non-Muslim community should also be appreciated.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And not only do we appreciate what they did in support of the Muslim community and come out and stood outside the mosques. You had grandmothers, white grandmothers, standing outside the mosques, I believe in Liverpool, who were with placards saying, "No, Nans are going to stand here guarding the mosque." You had a 70-year-old white male who said, "I'm outside the mosque," to show these thugs that you're not going to bring a place of worship down. And how sad is it that you target a place of worship? You target gravestones. How sad is that you're willing to go and smash gravestones, dead people who can't fight back? You target women and children because they are a vulnerable and easy target. Really shameful acts.
Absolutely.
What are we going to be looking at in terms of the aftermath? What are we going to see now as a response from the Muslim community? One thing I will say is there's always been kind of more trouble in terms of nationalistic, racist type of tension in the north than the south, right? Now, one thing is clear. In the north, you have many segregated areas. White neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, or what you'll find is majority of the ethnic minorities will live in the larger ethnic minority area.
Yeah.
Okay. There's good sides, there's positives and negatives to this. So what that means is, as a positive, if you are in the Asian community, you'll be safer, you will know, where to go and what have you. And maybe the white community might feel like that as well. But what's happened here is you've caused, without realizing, a divide. So I hope now the masajids, especially the mosques, especially the Muslim community, especially the Muslim leaders, now realize they need to go into those white areas and give more da'wah. Show them this is Islam. This is what Muslims are like. And bring that friendship. Teach them about Islam.
Yeah. I think it's a difficult one in many ways. Isolation, can definitely be a problem for us as a community, as a wider community, Muslim and non-Muslim, living together. And I certainly believe that interaction is an important part of da'wah, of presenting Islam as well. And there's no way to really do that unless you're willing to go out and speak to people. Now the problem is, if we look to the riots that happened, the places where Muslims suffered the most attacks and most violence and injuries were places where Muslims were a very small minority. And the places where the riots could never really reach were because of the huge turnouts in heavily Muslim populated areas like Walthamstow and Birmingham and Oldham and these kind of places. So, there is a safety and people are afraid. So I can completely understand why they want to live. And I've lived in both, minority areas as well as heavily Muslim populated areas as well. And there is a feeling of safety. There is a feeling of safety living among people who look like you, who you don't have to fear that racism from. You don't have to feel uneasy about saying Assalamu alaikum or dressing as a Muslim. You don't have to worry about that so much. So it is a real problem we need to address, and it's hard to say to somebody, give up your safety for the sake of this. And the other problem that we have is that da'wah has been heavily policed, and people are afraid to talk about Islam. People are afraid to talk about Palestine. They're going to lose their job. They're going to get cancelled. Something's going to happen to them. And that's a wider problem that we need to address. And if we do address that, I think it will bring the community together, because Islam is not something to be afraid of. And we heard messages like the one you mentioned before, people saying that Sharia will never be implemented here. And that's something which the government has also heavily tried to push as something bad, something evil, so that many people start to distance themselves from Islam, the Sharia, and say, oh no, I'm not one of them. I don't believe, we don't want Sharia here. But the real problem with this narrative is you are not addressing the inherent racism within the statement itself. What is your problem with Sharia? Why would you be worried about that? And we remember the Archbishop of Canterbury once came out and publicly said, well, you know what? Britain could learn a lot from implementing some elements of Sharia. And there was a huge uproar about how could he say something like that. Because the truth is, Sharia is not a bad thing. It's not a thing to be feared at all. Britain could benefit from Sharia, absolutely. We should not be afraid of that. And the demographics in this country are changing. Muslims are on the rise. Christianity is receding. The faces of the UK are changing, and I can understand why some people might be afraid of that. And that's another problem caused by nationalism, and why even democracy itself as a system, it creates a conflict which leads to things such as ethnic cleansing. So Bosnia, Serbia, they were afraid that Muslims would outnumber Christianity, and if you are outnumbered in a democracy, then they win the vote. So therefore they started ethnic cleansing. They started to commit genocide. The same thing is happening in Palestine. Why do they need to get rid of the Palestinians? Well, because if you claim to be a democracy, then that means if you're outnumbered, then you shouldn't really have a say. So it doesn't make sense. So they're trying to clean the land of other ethnicities. Same thing happened in Rwanda. It happened many, many times over. So people are afraid that the demographics are changing in the country such that Christianity will be a minority, that white people will be a minority, and that Muslims will have a greater voice. And that, it sounds good for a Muslim and bad for a non-Muslim if you are terribly afraid of what Muslims will do. But yeah, interaction, I do believe, will help to curb some of those fears, so people can realize actually Muslims are not the demons that we are made out to be.
With that, Jazakallah khair for your time, Abu Baraa, and no doubt we'll see you next time.
Well, yeah, inshallah.
But just as a last point, I would say that the emphasis we do need to make is really, you need to speak to your neighbor. That you lived next door to John, you've lived next door to Sarah for the last 12, 15, 20 years, and you've never had that conversation with them. You've not gone deep into what is Islam. How many times have you invited them to your house for a cup of tea, for example, right? One of my neighbors, she's white, English. I think she's English. She's got an English accent anyway. When it comes to Eid, she'll give us a gift, and we'll give her food, etc. So we have this kind of understanding between each other. So really, as you said, interaction is key here to avoid future rioting and avoid future hatred amongst the communities. And really, those thugs, rioters, trash, whatever you want to call them, they need to know that, in fact, a lot of us immigrant children have embraced Britain. We have embraced, you could say, if there are any values from Britain, we have embraced it, right? We have learned a lot from Britain. We have learned a lot from society here. And we've given so much back to society here as well. So with that, I would say to you, Jazakallah khair, and hope to see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.